Testing, testing. Good evening. Can you give me a response if you are able to hear me? Okay, thank you very much. So we'll start this lecture. So this lecture is, in fact, is a continuation of the last lecture on the political landscape of the city. But in this lecture, we will expand the scope a little bit to talk about a concept what we call governmentality, which is a instrument of urban politics. But we will use the example of, in a more general sense, about the state as an illustration. So that is basically the technology in imposing rules in a country. Of course, I mean, ruling a city is, it's a similar approach. But we'll try to discuss it from the perspective of some puzzle in perhaps in Western democracy, because we understand that in some country, the rules of the state, that's the government, or to be more precise, the central government, they use some deliberate power, and particularly power to control people, to set a lot of rules and set a lot of directives to people. But we also realize that in many so-called democratic states, basically there are countries in the West, in Europe, in North America, the government or the state is relatively small. And in fact, the people seem to enjoy a lot of freedom. So they can choose the government, they can do whatever they like, as long as within the law. But in fact, the law is rather relaxed. So you have a lot you can do in some countries, with compared to other countries, people enjoy more freedom. But there's a question. Does it mean that government in those countries, they are so-called relinquishing their power of control? So on the surface, it seems that it is. But if you look at it in a more critical way, some scholars, they will argue that in fact, those government in those so-called liberal countries, they rule, and their control is not lower than other countries that seems to have a higher level of control. But the way government in those more liberal countries rule that people are in a qualitatively different way. So that is what we want to describe that.
Sorry, Professor, we think we can't hear you now.
Sorry, I haven't unmuted myself. Sorry for that. You should not alert me earlier. So let me repeat a little bit. I just said last lecture, we'll describe about the power exercise within a city. Is what we call the city government. And we also have a focus on the exercise of power of the state. And this lecture will expand our scope of coverage a little bit to look at the power exercise of the state from a very beginning so-called description of power of the state. So we will look at the state as container of various things about power, and then about wealth, about culture, and about social elements. And we'll see that as an evolution, of course, from the perspective in what we call economically more advanced country, and many of them, they are so-called liberal, so-called countries. And in this respect, we will also differentiate two kinds of states, what we call a territorial state and a population state. Territorial state will concern more about the sovereignty, integrity of the sovereignty, and also interest of the state, quote unquote. But there's another kind of state, what we call a population state, which at least at the surface will cater more about the welfare of the people, but not necessarily what we call the integrity of the sovereignty of the territory. And in fact, the main issues we want to introduce is a concept of what we call governmentality, which is described as an art of governance. But unlike in some states who use power to control people, to set a lot of rules, and also do not allow people to have a lot of freedoms, at least at the surface, some liberal and developed, so-called economically developed countries, they have less control, people enjoy more freedoms, but it doesn't mean that those states, they are not exercising power. But they exercise power in a qualitatively different way. So that is the concern of the concept of governmentality. And we'll also use the governmentality to apply to the example of China, and to see in some specific aspect of China, how those governmentality approach also have an impact on how the Chinese state rule over people. So my lecture will simply divide it into three parts. One is to describe state as container, different kind of container, and also about a concept what we call territoriality. So the concern about territory and sovereignty. And of course, the later part of the lecture, I'll elaborate on the concept of governmentality. So state as container, in fact, would also indicate how the exercise of power of the state evolved over time. And basically, my discussion is based on the research of Taylor 2003, which is also in your reference list. So for Taylor, in fact, the state acts as container of various things. First, as a container of power, and the second, as a container of wealth, and the third is a container of culture, and the fourth is container of what we call the social, or the social elements. And in fact, if we take a historical perspective in looking at the evolvement, the evolution of the state, or the exercise of power of the state, most countries will go through this four elements, or some of them you may call it stage of exercising of state power. The first is in the very early history, when clustering of human population within a particular territory, and they define themselves as states. Of course, I mean, that is not the same as our sort of modern form of state, but at least they have a group of people who live together, they have common interests, and they may have leaders, they may have bureaucrats, and what they want to do is to defend themselves. So at that time, perhaps 100 and 1,000 years ago, those states, they are usually at war with each other because of the need to grab resources to protect their own territory. But with time goes on, they will realize that using war may not be the most effective way of survival. Not to mention that you need peace in order to develop the economy. So the state at this stage as a container of power not just to internally to the people of the state, but also they describe the relation between different states. So that power would likely mean the power to control its own people and also the power to fight with other states. So it's basically military power. And there is a tendency of changing from frequent war to a longer interval of peace, so that it's easier, in fact, and also more beneficial for economic development if the states can take a more defensive approach in exercise of power. So war is an aggressive expression of that power to expand the power. But defensive is a more passive exercise of power in order to keep peace. So in keeping peace and to be defensive, treaties between different states began. So in our very long histories, in 2,000 years ago, in China or in other countries, there are wars, but there are much longer period between wars. Sorry. And with a longer period between war and less war being occurred, the focus of the state have turned to the exercise of power in generating wealth. So states at that time has become a container of wealth. And this particularly relevant to what we call the city-state in the medieval time, I just mentioned in lecture 2, in Europe, especially in northern Italy. Because those city-states, they do not have military power, or they have very weak military power. But what they concentrate most of their energy is to create wealth by trading. But because of that, they are able to accumulate a lot of wealth so that people in those small city-states are much, much better off than other states who still take the state as a container of power. So they use military force to grab resources, but because of that, you have trade-off. And those small states, city-states, they concentrate on the generation of wealth and become much better off. So other states will like to imitate. Even bigger states, they will see that trade or economic development, in fact, is a better alternative in the exercise of power, because if you have wealth, you become more powerful in some sense, or even more powerful in terms of the military force, because you then have the resources to equip your army and also to draw people to fight for the state. So the city of Venice, the city of Florence are typical of those so-called state as a container of wealth. And later on, this slowly evolved into capitalism. And that the invisible hand will further so-called boost the economy and get the country wealthier. But it doesn't mean that the state has abandoned or relinquished the use of power. State is still a container of power, particularly military power, but it is of a secondary position, whereas the primary concern is to generate wealth. So even if you fight with each other, the basic goal of fighting is not to grab the resources, but to open up trade. So perhaps in the 18th and 19th century, the empirical power from Europe doing this to North America and then later on to Europe. So it's not just about ruling over people, but more important is to open up trade and to accumulate so-called resources, accumulate wealth. And then the state, when it becomes wealthier or the concern about the accumulation of wealth, they also will concern about culture. Because in the past, when state act as a container of power, the mechanism they use to unite people are basically what we call coercive power. So if you don't obey me, I'll exercise so-called sheer power over you to make you comply. And when they evolve into the container of wealth, they use wealth to employ people to fight or to incentivize people to fight. But this may not be as effective if you can use culture as the force of cohesion. And this force of cohesion not only help to build up your military power, but also help you to build up wealth as well. Because this identification will have some additional so-called cohesiveness on people of the same state. So it's also at that same time, particularly in the 19th century, the movement to set up nation states began. Because the state now is seen not just as some very pragmatic so-called assembly of people to create wealth, but it's also to assemble people who share similar culture. So cultural identity has become a uniting force to unite people within that state, what we call the modern nation state. So with that, in fact, you will incentivize people to fight for the country because of their cultural identity, not because they are being sort of forced upon by some sheer exercise of power, nor some so-called economic incentive. So that is also some very common way in mobilizing people to defend the country or even to fight with other countries under the name of sort of national identity or national interest. So the formation of a nation state was relatively recent, in fact. So, but this will also lead to some negative consequence of sort of some ultra-white states about the Nazis, the fascists, of this kind of twisting the cohesiveness of a nation state and try to conquer the world. Of course, I mean, there is some exception. Within those nation states who have already accumulated enough so-called wealth and who do not need to use military power to create wealth, and they began to turn on what we call some kind of social element. Take, for example, they allow people to have more say so as to implement democracy. so as to create a more stable sort of political system, because there is an institutional setup in the peaceful change of power, but not while struggle, internal struggle, or fight with each other. With the unfolding of democracy, in fact, there is also a shift of attention from controlling people to providing more welfare to people. Of course, I mean, you can interpret that as also an incentive for the people to work hard and to create more wealth, and also to develop a stronger cultural identity or a national identity by creating welfare. So this, in fact, go in hand with each other. If people have say, in fact, the first thing they would like to do is to enhance their own welfare. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Because for them, the ultimate goal of a state or any government is to improve the quality of living and also the welfare of people. But of course, intertwining with that are some other concern about equity, about equality. So those countries, if they change from the states from a container of sort of culture to a container of social element, usually they will adopt a more people-centered approach in ruling over people. And this is the exercise of power on one hand. But on the other hand, in fact, a state is also linked up with territory. And there is another branch of sort of perspective in looking at the development of states, perhaps with the analogy with the building of territory of animals. Because any human activity, including the state activity, they need space. And within the space, you are defining the territory so that you have full control of any kind of activity within that particular space without the interference of others from other countries, of course. So there's something what we call sovereignty. Sovereignty, in fact, is also accompanied with the building of nation states. Perhaps it may be clear for us because we have a so-called long history of imperial ruling by the royal family. But in fact, at that time, there's nothing called sovereign state or sovereignty or nation state. So the countries belong to the royal family or just the emperor. So people fight for the emperor, but not fight for the country. So the sovereignty of a country is, in fact, a rather recent invention or a rather recent concept. And this sovereignty now we're attached to a particular boundary of territory. So even if we talk about the state as a container of the social element, in fact, we have presumed that the exercise of power for these states are in fact confined within some particular location or boundary or territory. So this will link up with our discussion of place, but in a so-called bigger scale. So it's not just a place of a neighborhood of a city, but also of the country, that nation state. So a state can also have to be interpreted or to understood as the exercise of power within that territory. But in fact, a state is also a social construct, particularly about what we understood as sovereignty of the state. it is a social construct. And that social construct, in fact, is being created on the basis of social relations and social interaction. So if we understood about the different sort of fraction of the state, whether they unite together or they are separated, we need to understand this territoriality within that social construct of social relation between different group of people. Particularly, we may have some kind of sort of blind spot as a Chinese, because we have been experienced for very long what we call a united kingdom, which is ruled by the emperor, and we have a vast but relatively so-called intact territory. So if we see other countries, for instance, different states agree to stick together as some kind of configuration of federal state, but each state has its relative autonomy, and that is something that it's hard for us Chinese to understand. So, but I want to shift your attention to what we call a united country or a confederation of states. In fact, is at a different stage of the interpretation of that social construct of social relation between different group of people. So at least for me, there's nothing wrong if a united country cannot stick together, they may split, and the splits may be benefit to each other. Take, for example, we have a lot of those examples recently, I mean, several decades ago, when the Eastern Bloc in Eastern Europe dissolved, and many countries, in fact, they are being broken down into different countries, but then each country may survive even better than before. But of course, we can also see a lot of other examples that people will voluntarily want to stick together within a country because that will take as a beneficial to each other. So, but that is one way of understanding territory of the state. But another perspective is to look at the state as historically produced. But it also keeps on changing. So it's a historically produced but continually mutated sort of entity. So we need to understand the geography of the space, the exercise of political power, and also the control. And particularly about the land as a physical property. But that land as a physical property it also have to understood between the what we call the terrain of political power, the power relation between sort of different portions of those territories. So in this respect, when we return back to the evolution in state as container, so a state to begin with, they are the container of power, exercising control over people, and usually is for the benefit of the ruling group of the ruling class. But later on, when the state evolve and become as a social element container, in fact, they change their main concern. So the territorial state, in fact, concerned about the integrity of the territory. But when its shift is concerned to culture, to the social element, they shift the concern on people. So it's what we describe as population state. So this is perhaps some context for our subsequent discussion, because some scholars argue that this kind of argument for evolution or for the progression of state power, although it sounds very good, but it's too ideal. Because even for the states who do not exercise sheer coercive power, may be using some alternative way of power and controlling people. So to put it simple, it is shifting from a hard way of control to something of soft control. So this is the so-called the background of the concept of governmentality, which is developed by a French sociologist, political science, and philosopher. Like Henry Lefebvre, they have a lot of heads because they basically are describing some philosophy in rule of the state. So what he called governmentality. Before I introduce Foucault, perhaps some of you may have read the article I prescribed on urban regime, on Karen Stone's urban regime paper, because in his paper, he also described two kinds of exercise of power, which may be a little bit simpler than Foucault's conception. So I introduce first, because for the Stone's conception about power, he identified two kinds of power. One is called power over, and the other is called power to describe how the urban regimes exercise control over people they rule in the city, or those who are in the ruling fraction of the urban regime. Power over is a form of coercion. So it's the most traditional and primitive form of exercising of power, using coercion to force people to comply. And with that, in fact, it resulted in a lot of resistance. So that's what we saw in the history of China, in various dynasties, that because at that time, the state is basically between the container of wealth and the container of power. So what they use is about the coercive force to make people comply to the rule of the royal family. So there are frequent resistance, military resistance, resisting high tax, resisting the quest for forced labor, or the resistance for forced conscription to fight for the royal family. At that time, there's no conception about the state or the nation state. So those people, they are not fighting for the country, but they just fight for the emperor. So this old way of power over. What Stone described is in the urban regime, they don't use power over because they use persuasion, they use financial interest to unite the members in the ruling sort of urban regime. So they are using a alternative power exercise, what we call power to. Power to is a collective exercise of power and also in the name of empowerment. So using some clever means to push you to comply to the interests of the urban regime. So that is a very simple interpretation of these two concepts. But of course, I mean, there is a myth how those power to approach is being exercised. We can only see the results, but Stone haven't described the process of achieving the power to. So without using coercive force, people are willing to comply. And sometimes even more enthusiastically. So that's captured in the concept of governmentality by Michel Foucault. And Foucault described this as an art of government. So in fact, the art of government is already sort of realized by a United States president. So before the war, Harry Truman on the art of government. So it's similar to the conception of Stone's, you cannot use power over, you need to use power to, and then how to exercise those power to create the power to status is an art. So for Foucault, in fact, governmentality is defined as an ensemble formed by the institution, procedures, analysis, and reflections, and the calculation and tactics that allow the exercise of this very specific, but complex form of power. So power is not just a simple coercion. Don't allow you to do this, you have to follow me on this and on that. So like what Stone had described, I empower you, I give you power, but you will voluntarily follow what I hinted you to do. So that is what we call a subtle exercise of power to push people along the direction. So for him, for Foucault, governmentality is an exercise of a complex form of power, the art of government, but it's also a very skillful and specific exercise of power on various kind or various type of governing subjects. So for him, he also started with the evolution of power exercise from coercion, from force, to what he called the productive power. So power not by the use of coercion. So before the exercise of productive power, in fact, there is a gradual evolution. And his first very famous study of the exercise of power, to be more precise, about the change in exercise of power, is a study on discipline and punishment. Because in all those so-called medieval states or the pre-modern states, they use very harsh punishment. So of course, nowadays, some countries, they still use very harsh punishment. Take for example, in some country in Middle East, if you are committed an offense of stealing, your hand will be chopped off. So just to deter people from committing the stealing. And if you commit adultery, that is to marry people, or you engage in some kind of relations with sort of married people, particularly married women, you'll be stoned to death, so that to deter you with this severe sort of punishment. But Foucault has studied the change of that control even within the prison. How the prison officer disciplined the prisoner, but without the use of coercion, because the prison is perhaps a very extreme example about the exercise of power. Because the prison officer, they have the absolute power to control over the prison. But as you can imagine, unless you lock all the prisoners up all the time, otherwise, the number of prisoners will far outnumber the number of prison officers. So it is very difficult to control the prisoners. So he studied how those exercise of discipline are being enforced in a prison situation. So he has so-called come up with some very creative ideas on how to set up a surveillance post of what he called a circular prison, so that the prisoners always have the impression that they are being surveilled all the time by a relatively small number of prison officers. With this, in fact, he go on to do more research and argument and try to develop some very clever way of exercising of power making people willingly to complicit in their own governance, but while through a network of diverse institutions, agents, and individuals who share common interests in the alliance. So it's also forming a coalition so that they can push the same governing agenda over the overwhelming majority of common people, as if all the common people are very willing to follow those directions. So you need to set up an institution, you need to set up the agenda, you need to set up a network of pushing that. So it's perhaps a more general form of what Stone described as urban regime. But this is not just for the ruling of a small city, but it's the country. So in fact, the country will form such a big network of some agreed agenda, perhaps it's implicit, to push the interests of the alliance of those power holders. But at the very surface, those powers are in fact being shared with common people. But common people, in fact, most of them have not the opportunity to shape those agenda or even have any impact on those policies. So the alliance are basically formed by the legislature and also the states and or other or concentrated social funding to gear people towards a certain direction. And it's also about the concentration of power. At the same time, there's a perceived devolution of power or empowering common people. So this is a contradiction, but this is a clever exercise of power. So the central theme of setting up those alliance and those centralization of power is to achieve competition and also to achieve the balance of power. So the centralization of power and the balance of power, it may seem contradictory, but it has to be exist at the same time. So some power is being concentrated, but some power is being devolved to other people. So to achieve, at least at the surface, some balance of power. So in fact, we already captured this in a managerial approach in how a city is run. So although on the surface, the ordinary people have the right to elect their own officials, but they all belong to the same group of elites. So it seems that the power of choosing your official have been devolved, but in fact, the power have been concentrated to this small clique of elites. In achieving those so-called exercise of power and push people to act voluntarily towards the agenda set by the sort of ruling fraction of ruling regimes, Foucault also described sort of 4 elements in implementing that governmentality. The first is to set some kind of political rationality, and also to set up governmental program, to implement governmentality technology, and also to create expert alliance. Before we can implement governmentality or the art of government, or in the words of other scholar on governmentality, is rule at a distance, or the exercise of power at a distance. So I do not have to set side by side to make you comply by using sheer force, coercion. I can look at you in a distance, and then you will voluntarily follow my direction of development, so that the end result is in the interest of the ruling fraction. but not the ordinary people. So first of all, you need to set up some kind of political rationality for that. To set up something is good for the country, for the people. But this is not just by saying. So you cannot just say that this is good for you, this is good for the country, or this is good for both you and the country. That's not enough. Because you need to develop some kind of practice in an appropriate mean, which is grounded upon your knowledge. So you cannot simply say that you need to do that because doing that is good to you. You need to be backed up by, for instance, some very rigorous research demonstrating that if you do this, you will achieve some desirable result. But of course, not everything can be so scientific. So perhaps you need to pretend it's rational. So you follow this because you're rational, because there are hard evidence that if I do this, I will generate the results I like. So the reason vaccination of COVID is perhaps one example on that. I'm not quite sure whether anybody have so could remember, not just in Hong Kong, but also in some Western countries, about what we call the group immunity. So either a large number of people are vaccinated or they get contracted, so they can get the antibody as resisting the virus, so that you can prevent the virus from infecting you. So they have a lot of those sort of evidence, so what they call quote unquote scientific evidence on that, because what they want is to push vaccination, the rate of vaccination, because that will be perceived as one very proactive way in preventing the pandemic. But of course, now we all know that the rate of vaccination, group immunity is just something unreal. Although it's not fake, but it would not deliver what the government at that time promised to deliver. So even if you get 3 doses, you still get infected. But of course, now the narrative or the discourse is that if you get vaccinated, even if you get infected, the death rate will be lower. I mean, it's this kind of what we call discourse, grounded on theories articulated in a distinct language and vocabulary, pretending that to be somewhat scientific. Although the pandemic may not be a most appropriate example because that is a matter of life and death, but for other policy, for instance, keeping you healthy, fighting climate change. I mean, this kind of what we call scientific narrative on evidence may be something misleading. So in doing that, they will refrain from regulating people's conduct. But they will only gear people towards political action, because that will so-called frame the direction and the content of that rationality and discourse. And they will also silently push those regulations outside of politics, because they start with only on politics, because that is a means of empowerment. If we confine those discussions in politics, but they will also silently extend those regulations outside politics, but also at the same time trying to maintain the autonomy of individual citizens or the individual social groups. in doing that, in fact, they are encouraging the citizens as an autonomous, subjective so-called subject. And they seemingly would act as independent agents. The other elements of implementing governmentality is to develop governmental programs. So if you have that discourse, it will, if it is only being confined to political debates, to political narrative, you will achieve nothing, because you need to translate it into actual practice. And then the actual practice is what we call governmental program. So to translate the political rationality into a set of campaign and institutional arrangement. Perhaps I'll give some example a moment later when we talk about the exercise of governmentality in China. And turning into that, a more biological analogy will be frequently employed, so that it's just like diagnosing the social ill, prescribing some medicines to cure your disease. And one way of doing that, of course, I'm not talking about physical disease, it's about social disease. One way of concentrating people's attention to that so-called social disease is a process what we call problematization, targeting on some social issues as problematic, and also framing those issues as threat and challenge to the society, either to the economy or to the morality of the society, so that the state will justify intervention into that. And with the intervention, they may be able to exercise control, but the control is in the name of eradicating or at least mitigating that social illness. So at some point of time, even in the United States, for instance, in the early part of the 20th century, there is a very rapid development in mental illness, so that a lot of people are being diagnosed as mentally ill, so that they will be thrown to prison. Because the government do not want to use coercion to lock those people down, because they are being perceived as threatening the ruling fraction of the country. But if you identify them as mentally ill, you are changing the means of control by creating a rational narrative or discourse, what we call that political rationality in the threat of people who are mentally ill. And you make those issues a problem with scientific knowledge, research, and you build a lot of those so-called mental asylums to take those people with mental illness in and lock them down for years, even without passing through the judiciary system. Because if they are being put in the judiciary system, very likely they will not be found guilty of breaking any law. That program is not enough, because you also need what they call the governmentality technology. So that with those strategy and mechanisms, which are operatable, you can connect the expectation and the behavior. so that the technology, in fact, will be used to justify the intervention. So the government used a lot of quote unquote objective report, charts, and maps. Report defining mental illness so that they can lock you up in the asylum, and that's a mental hospital to retrain you, to monitor your behavior. And in this way, it's rebuilding the identity and the interest. And of course, one final and not to be missed puzzle is about developing an expert alliance, because with those narratives, with those scientific knowledge, with those governmental programs, with those very routine charts and reports, you need the underpinning or the support of the experts, because they are the one who will explain to the general public the intention and the program of the authority, because they have the expertise knowledge, and they can also change the narrative to a very technical vocabulary and language. And they will also act as representative of the truth. And usually with those experts, they appear to be independent, autonomous, but they also would have a more what we call enclosed circle, so that those enclosed circle of groups of experts align with the interests of the authority. Let me put a very quick example on that from one of my research on the governmentality of social work development in China. The paper I wrote together with my other social research colleagues about 10 years ago, to explain why social work is being developed so quickly in China. And it's the development of social work one way of implementing governmentality in China. Because China over the years, it may not be applied now, over the years have evolved from a countries that used to exercise coercion, particularly before the economic reform. And then because of the economy and the society becoming more complicated, the use of coercion is getting more expensive and less effective. Because in the past, you only need a small number of people to control the behavior of other people, because other people's activities have already been confined to a small locality. So everybody has to stick to the locality, like the hukou system we discussed 2 lectures ago, that people are not allowed to move around. So you have a fixed number of people, you know each other, and it's your subject of control. And everybody, or not everybody, but literally everybody work for state agency or organization. So that economic entity will also exert a control over the small number of the employees. So it's easier to control with less effort. But when people are free to move around, and a lot of people work outside the state sector, and this kind of control has been sort of lifted. So that it's not that easy to control the behavior of people. Even if you want to control, you can only control over a small area, a short period of time, and also within a very sort of small scope. So you can control the internet occasionally, but you cannot cut off the internet all the time because you have to pay the economic cost. So China has increasingly relaxed the power and people have more freedom. But what we query is it a change of governing so-called approach from what we call a coercive power to governmentality? So we use the same framework about political rationality, governmental program, governmental technology, and also alliance expert to see whether the development of social work, in fact, is a form of governmentality. So as I just mentioned earlier, the market reform had made the state weakening the disciplinary power. And of course, it's also a great loss of the coercive power. It's still possible to be coercive, but you cannot do it all the time over everybody because it's too expensive and there is a very high cost of trade-off. And at the same time, the introduction of capital market reforms promote capitalism. And in fact, in the past, socialist ideology is still a sort of ruling sort of technology at that time. But with this sort of modern time, modern economic development, and that is losing favor. So how the states develop new strategy of control and steering. So we start with the new direction of the party and the state in creating a harmonious society at that time. And we concentrate the attention on the residential neighborhood as an example. Because in the residential neighborhood, it's easier for us to observe. And also within the residential neighborhood, we can get access to families and individuals. So in creating that political rationality, what are the process of that problematization? We discovered that in the residential neighborhood, the states have portrayed the neighborhood as losing a sense of community. There's a lot of narrative, a lot of that formal and informal reports comparing the new commodity neighborhood with the neighborhood before the economic reforms, particularly about the work unit compound. And also, problematization is trying to portray the encouragement of self-responsibility of family and individual as counteracting that loss of sense of community and the complexity of the society. And in this respect, in fact, they also will emphasize about the deterioration and family and personal capacity in coping with the more modern and incoming sort of problem. So the governmental programs in the residential neighborhood is the creation of the program as what we call the civilized community, 文明社区. Because a civilized community is being portrayed as an instrument or programs to regain the sense of cohesiveness about the party and the state implementing services to bring good quality of life to the residents. And also at the same time, achieve some kind of civilized behavior. But at the same time, they he also encouraged the setup of the homeowners association as a object and also a subject to share the power. But at the same time, the parallel institution of the residence committee, the 居委会, are also being strengthened in order to help to create that civilized community. And of course, there are also, within the law, the proposed sort of devolution of power to make the homeowners self-manage their own sort of community. So there's a lot of that governmental program, which is supported and strengthened by the real right law, 物权法, and also the property management law, 物业管理条例. But at the same time, the party state also shift the attention on what they call the party development or party construction, which based on the work units in the past and shifted partly to the grassroots. So now the neighborhood party organization will take the responsibility in creating civilized community with the residents committees as the lead, but with the homeowners association supporting within the context of what they call the homeowner self-management. And this is what the resident committee have done in the so-called local neighborhood. But at the same time, in fact, to combat the deterioration of family and personal capacity, they advocate a person-centered approach by hugely expanded the social workforce, of course, with the associated social worker training. And the government, in fact, set aside a lot of resources, at least for a few big cities, in buying those social work services from the welfare agency, which are run by some vaguely defined sort of NGO, non-governmental organizations. But what the governmentality technology they do is to align these two lines of development of devolving power, increasing control in a unified manner in the local residential community, in setting up the political rationality about the losing of ideal community, about the deterioration of personal and family capacity in dealing with problems, but at the same time, to set up some kind of authority expectation about the lead of the party in that residential so-called neighborhood by setting up governmental programs of civilized community and the strengthening of social workforce. And in fact, for some cities, they merge these two. So the implementation of the civilized social community would partly rely on the property management agent, but some residence committee through the street offices directly employ or they outsource some of the tasks in that community, the civilized community programs to social workers, so that the social worker will help the individuals to change their behavior towards the direction of setting up a so-called civilized community. And with those independent homeowners association, although the law have set up institutions that will allow the homeowners association self-manage. But at the same time, this governmental technology through the registration and finance impose some control on this quote unquote independent homeowners association. So you need to register, you need to file your establishment, and if your registration is not being approved, you are not allowed to operate independently. Even your registration is being approved, you need to be constantly, regularly supervised by the residents committee, and they even will interfere into the election. Of course, that will stir up some independent homeowners association to exercise their rights to launch collective action against those controls. But then the residents committee, they will organize their party members and the loyalist group in supporting the action against those collective action, or to mobilize some action supporting the government move through the residents committee. So, in fact, in this sort of technology about registration, about defining the problem or developing government programs, they want to push residents subtly to follow the new rule of the game voluntarily. So it's to align those control with the provision of personal services by the local government, while the private service agent with some contract condition. And this to align together via the so-called the technology of short-term contract and funding, and also to control the registration of the private or the non-governmental social service agency to ensure that they will follow the direction set by the local government. Because they also use the control on the renewal of that in subject those agencies to the direction prescribed by the local government by setting up what they call the annual audit. And this is also reflected in the training of social workers curriculum in the social work programs. And at the same time, the use of big data and use the social credit are additional controlling mechanisms. So that if you don't follow this general direction and follow the new rule of the games, you will get your social credit sort of being deducted, and with a low social credit, there's many things you are unable to do. So of course, in this respect, they need expert alliance of social workers, of housing managers, data experts to integrate those data in order to impose a more rigorous but more extensive sort of control over individuals' behavior. So to put it short, in fact, governmentality will describe the exercise of power of the state over an individual, but not in a direct way, but indirectly either through the society or through the market. So in the Chinese case, it's more through the society. So using some non-state means, but with the very intensive gearing of the state on the society to frame people's behavior. And whereas in Western country, they use the market force more on that. So to have a very short summary, we describe governmentality as an art of governance, rules not by direct coercion, but by other more clever and indirect way. But within that, we also need to understand the exercise of power of the state within a territory. It's what we call it territoriality and territorialization. So that will apply to the small neighborhood as well. So how to exercise the power within that small neighborhood. But it will also involve blurring the boundary of the territory. Try to extend so-called those exercises of power beyond those so-called small territories. And governmentality is an art of government to shift from what we call a disciplined power to productive power by setting political rationality, program of the government, governmental technology, and experts alliance on that. Perhaps I stop here and see whether I also have no voice. Sorry, I missed those. No, but that was before 7, is it? So is it okay that after 7, most of my voice are being heard? Okay, perhaps I stop here and see whether you have any question you would like to ask. So again, we'll take a break of 10 minutes. So after that, we'll start the presentation and you have to log into a sort of new link in Zoom. So I'll keep this this checkbox for another 5 to 6 minutes, so that if you have any problem, any questions, you can write it down on that. And I have also shared the PowerPoint of the presentation of the section of the topic PO2 with you. So if you have not read the PowerPoint, you can go to the Canvas announcement and there's a link there. So you can have a look on that. So I have to thank the presentation group to share with us their presentation file. So I will also encourage you to go to the discussion forum in Canvas so that you can write down the question you would like to ask the presentation group, so that they can select some of the issues they want to address. So I will encourage every one of you to write down at least one question on that as a training of your critical mind and to test your understanding of the presentation. So although I'm not confident that they can address every of your question if you have 40 to 50 questions being asked, but perhaps that is also a process of training up your critical mind and your capacity of asking question, understanding presentation. Okay, see you again after the break.